Get shik edosh Diné, Shayla Kodaska in Shet, as she in Nashla, Twitch eat me, but chin, as I said, the edosh Chado Dashnella. Twin nest is a dead Nasha, a day Portland de Shilgan. And I'm originally from White Mesa, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. I currently live in Portland, Oregon. I am Salt people born for Bitterwater, and my paternal and maternal grandparents are mini goats. So my story starts at my grandma's house. I was born when my parents were in college, and they originally met each other when they were attending Haskell University. And back at that time, it was actually a junior college. So it was the boarding school, and then it became a junior college, and then it became a university. And so now it's a university in Lawrence, Kansas. And so my parents met there, and then they moved back home to Arizona, and they were attending Northern Arizona University. And so when they were in school there, my mom was a nursing student, and my dad, when he originally first started, was an engineering student. And they had me over spring break. I was born on a Monday because my birth story is that she went to the hospital because her water broke on Thursday night, and then they tried to give her Pitocin to induce her. But I wasn't coming out, and so then they told her not to travel very far, but they still did travel. They went out to my Nulla's house, and they went to go visit over there, and then they came back Monday, and I still wasn't ready yet. And so then they gave her some more Pitocin to try to get me to come out, and I finally was born. And so they had me, and then she went back to class Tuesday. And then she would take her little donut with her to be able to sit down in class because it was painful to sit because she had stitches. And then they would also, they would have me in the cradle board because my mom would take me with her to class. And then they alternated their schedule. And so they would make sure that one of them or my aunt was there at the apartment with me while they were in class. And so they kept me with them in Flagstaff until I was 8 months old. And then when I turned 8 months, they gave me to my aunt and my grandma. And so this is where I grew up, is out at my grandma's house after I was 8 months old, all the way until I started school, when my mom finished nursing school, and then I moved to Tuba City. And so at my grandma's house, when I lived out at my grandma's house, there was quite a few of our relatives that lived out there. And so this is located between Chichimito and Kienta, Arizona. So this is Black Mesa on the picture on the right, and this is the old hogan that my mom grew up in when she was a little person. And they're fixing up the roof on top, and so my nephew is mixing the clay, so we're patching up the roof on top. And so this is where I grew up, and I was given to my aunt and my grandmother. And my aunt and my grandmother, they both only spoke Navajo because they never went to boarding school, and their whole livelihood was livestock. So back then they still had hundreds of heads of sheep and cattle and horses, and we had chickens. And so all the work that went into that's what they did. And so there also was, so my aunt that raised me, her name is Rose, and then she had a daughter. And then I had my aunt June, who lived maybe like 100 yards up the hill, and she has 3 daughters and a son then. And then my aunt Lean lived maybe 50 yards away, and she had 2 sons. And then I also had my youngest uncle, and he was, I think he might have still been in high school at that time. So there's a wide range of ages of relatives that I have, because my aunt that raised me she's the oldest of the siblings. And so the age difference between my mom and my aunt is quite a few years, about 20 years. And so my uncle actually convinced me that my mom was my sister, and that my aunt was my mom. And so that was what I always got teased about. It was like, oh no, that's your sister. And now looking back at it as a mom, I was like, oh, I feel for my mom, because like that must have hurt to have to like leave me behind and then be called your sister when she came to see me. And so that's where I grew up, is out at my grandma's house. And when I was there, because my aunt and my grandma were my main caretakers, even though we had all these other relatives. So Navajo, Diné was my first language. And then when we got hurt, when we had ailments happen to us, like we used our traditional medicine, we used the plants, everything that was out there. And we didn't really, like, we would go to the hospital if like you were bleeding. And then once my, and so that was kind of like the beginning, the foundation of all the things that grew from there. And so when my mom finished nursing school, I moved to Tuba City. And so my mom finished school first and we moved to Tuba City. And when she first started working there, she was a nurse I believe she started in the adult care unit and then moved to short stay surgery. And so when she worked in adult care, I would go with her to work because there wasn't anybody to watch me, and she worked 12-hour shifts. So she would work from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I would get up in the morning and I would go with her to work. And when I would go to work with her, I would wait at the nursing station and then I would go walk to school because the school is right across the street from the hospital in Tuba. And so I got really comfortable with the hospital there, and I got really comfortable being in that environment. And when I was in high school, I started volunteering at the hospital, and I started volunteering, and it was just more so because I was interested in healthcare, and I just had the opportunity to be able to be in that environment. And back then it was still just an Indian Health Services hospital. So it wasn't the corporation that it is now. It's not a 638. And so when I volunteered in the hospital there, I started in adult care unit, and then I did short stay surgery. And this is mainly because of my mom. And then I ended up in the emergency department. And in the emergency department, there's a lot of patients that come through. And back then there wasn't any providers. All the main providers were non-native. And the support staff, there was Native people and there was Navajo people that worked there, but a lot of them didn't speak the language. And this is due to like colonization, when you have the boarding schools and then you have the population of people that go through boarding schools and then their kids that go through, there's just not a lot of interest in wanting to be able to teach the language and pass it on, because sometimes there's this idea of, if we pass it on, then it'll hinder us, it'll hold us back. And so a lot of people don't want to pass the language on, unfortunately. And I feel like a lot of our Indigenous communities deal with that. And so even though there was people that were older than me, they didn't speak the language, but we still have a big population of our elders that only speak Navajo. And so they would pull me in the room as a 13, 14-year-old, and I would have to translate. So I'd go in there and I'd translate for people. And so that was kind of my really big push toward wanting to be a provider, because I wanted to be in my community and be able to provide services and to be able to help and be able to actually understand where people are coming from and like really respect the medicine, because a lot of people still come in using our traditional medicine in it. And so I wanted to have that understanding and be able to actually talk with my patients directly. And so that was my really big push to go into medicine. And so when I was in high school, I started looking into BA MD programs. And so these are programs where you're pretty much applying to medical school as a high school student. And so you apply and and there's very few of these programs. There's one program at the University of New Mexico, and that's where I was looking at. And so at that program, you apply from high school, you get in, you finish your bachelor's and medical degree in about 6 years, and then you're a medical doctor. And it was actually a family friend that sat down with me and kind of really tried to explain to me the different types of health care providers and different types of schools that are out there. Because I grew up in Indian Health Services, where you go to the hospital and you get assigned a provider and you don't know that you have different options. Like, you don't know that there are MDs, you don't know that there is osteopathic doctors and naturopathic doctors, and what a physician's assistant is, what a nurse practitioner is. You just go in and you get assigned to somebody and you see them for 10 or 15 minutes and then you leave. And so when this family friend really sat down and told me, okay, these are different schools, these are the the different backgrounds that they come from, like what is allopathic medicine, what is osteopathic medicine, what is naturopathic medicine. When I learned about the differences, that's when it was like, oh, well, naturopathic medicine and osteopathic medicine just makes more sense to me. And so that's when I let go of applying to the BA-MD programs. And so I opted for going, I guess, a more traditional route of just doing my undergrad and then working slowly toward going into medical school. And so I graduated from high school in Tuba City, and I ended up going to undergrad at Dartmouth. And so my trajectory to Dartmouth was also really influenced by the family friend, because I had never looked at going into a school like Dartmouth. I was just looking at schools that were in state, and I was looking at just going to schools where I could get the prerequisites done to be able to get into medical school. And so my really big pull toward Dartmouth was that they had a really large support system around being able to graduate Native students. Because that's something that I didn't know was an issue. But when we're looking at data around Native American students that go into higher education, we have not the greatest retention rates. Most schools are around like 10%, which means that for 100 students that are Native American that start in a college, only about 10 of them will actually finish at that school. And schools like Dartmouth that have a really big support system around their Native students, they actually graduate 80 to 90% of their students. And so that was my really big pull to going to Dartmouth, was that they had a Native American community, and it really did help me. Because when I went there, I had a really hard time. I lost a friend and right before I went to school there. And so that really affected my mental health. And so when I started there, I started at Dartmouth with the intention of doing pre-med. And so I signed up for my pre-med classes and I tried to start taking them, but it was extremely hard coming from a reservation school where I had never taken calculus, and all of the math and science classes at Dartmouth are actually calculus based. So the lowest math class you can take is calculus. And so that really made me question whether or not I could make it in medical school, or whether I could even take the courses to be able to get into medical school. And so that shifted my the classes that I was taking. And so I shifted toward taking a lot of Native American studies classes. And so when I was there, I ended up majoring in Native American studies, and we learned a lot about history. We learned a lot about like current political things that were happening, and it really helped me to understand like why things are the way they are for us, especially like back home, because I understood the way that I lived. I understood maybe a little bit of where my parents were coming from, but I didn't really understand the history and how that affected like who I was, and like all the different policies that affect me as an Indigenous person in the United States. And so that really set the foundation for me to understand those things and to really see how healthcare is affected by those too. And then I also, one of the other things that really made a difference for me at Dartmouth was I grew up doing artwork. So my dad is a fan maker. And so from when I was about 5 years old, I helped my dad make fans. And so I was the one that was over there steaming feathers. If he was gourds, I was using like shaping off the outside of the gourds to make the gourds. And I had to cut all the little feathers. And so that was my job from when I was literally little, is just working with my dad. And so when I was at Dartmouth, one of the things that in my brain was like, oh, you don't go to school for art. Like that's not something you go to school for. But I didn't realize how connected that was to my health, and for my brain to really work and function like optimally. And so once I started taking art classes, I would take one art class every semester, and my grades improved significantly. And that really helped me get through, because it was my way of being able to connect back home, because I included a lot in my artwork, like our traditional stories. And because I grew up with my grandma and my aunt, where and my parents, where they talked a lot about our traditional ways. And like through either Native American church or Navajo tradition. And so I included that a lot in my artwork because that was also a way that I really held onto and connected and really appreciated more of my culture, because when I was back home, I didn't understand how much of that was actually really important to my identity until I was thousands of miles away. And then I graduated. And so after I graduated, I did an unofficial post-bac. And a post-bac is where somebody graduates with their bachelor's degree and then will go on and do all of their pre-medicine classes. And so for me, by this time, it had been 4 years since I had taken a math class. And so when I had taken the placement exam to see where I would be placed to start with my math classes, because math is where you start for pre-meds classes, I was placed in elementary algebra. And so that first placement test set me back all the way, like years and years of math, but it also gave me a good place point of where I needed to start it, to be able to build back up to be able to get to the point where I have to take calculus and I have to take like the biomedicine and I have to take the organic chemistry. And so I went back to Arizona and I started like at the community colleges. So I started at Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, and I started just taking the classes, 1 or 2 classes at a time. And I tried to stay with the community colleges because it was what is affordable, because at that time it was $50 a credit hour at Coconino versus going to NAU, where I priced it at that time and it was going to be like $4,000. And so I stayed with the community colleges and then transferred down to the Maricopa community colleges and then finished the rest of my my higher pre-medicine classes there. And then I started, I applied to the medical schools. And by this time I had really solidly identified with naturopathic medicine. And the reason why is because for me, naturopathic medicine seemed the closest in terms of the way that I grew up practicing and using medicine, which is where like, if we had different ailments, especially around like physical ailments or mental health ailments, like we would go through our traditional medicine, and then if we had something that was more serious or that was like traumatic, like one time my little brother almost chopped off his finger, and so like then we had to go to the ER. And so naturopathic medicine is closer in terms of that, in that naturopathic medicine uses herbs, we use like homeopathy, we use physical medicine, so physical touch, massage, and in addition to that, being able to still order tests, so still order lab tests or order imaging tests. And so for me, it felt like a really good balance between the two. And so that ended up being the type of medical program that I was looking at and applied to. And so I finished my medical school training in Oregon. So I actually started my medical school training in Phoenix at Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine. And I originally had started there because I just felt like there was more support within the Native students, because I had actually called all the naturopathic medical schools to see if any of them had Native American medical students. And the only one that had one was in Phoenix, in Tempe. And they had one Native student, and she was from White Mountain Apache. And so I connected with her, and for me, it was really great to have that support, because by the time I started, there was actually 4 Native people that were going to school there. And so they were a great support in that first year that I was there. But then I just needed additional support outside of that, because I had things like accommodations to be able to take my tests outside of the classroom and to be able to have additional time, and needing that support around counseling too. And so those things, because the school was newer, didn't have those types of things available. And so I transferred to the school in Oregon, which is the school here is called National University of Natural Medicine, and it's quite a bit older. And so because it's older, they have a lot more support around their students. And so here at the school, I was able to take advantage of like academic support specialists, career services, and then also the counseling. And the counseling piece for me was essential because at this time in my life was when I was first addressing a sexual assault that happened when I was a child. And so being able to address that kind of wove into the trajectory of what I was studying, because before this, I was really focusing on family medicine. And so when I started really learning about like trauma in the body and how that can be really held, like when we were thinking about the fascia in the body from the chin all the way down through the abdomen into the pelvic floor, and how this really affects our bodies and like how we hold things, but also like our breathing ability and our, like when we develop different things in our abdomen, in our wombs, and then even affecting birth and how that affects like the birthing process. That's when everything really started shifting toward being able to address those things, because I had to address those things in myself. And so in naturopathic school, I ended up going the route of doing midwifery training. In midwifery school, I did additional training in midwifery, and this is specifically for home births. So in my third year of medical school, started attending home births and assisting. And so this meant that I was on call 24/7 for 4 different midwives. And anytime, if it was in the middle of the class, it was the middle of the night, you just get up and you go and you help set up the equipment, and you're there taking blood pressures and doing all the things that you would normally see a nurse do. And so through those couple of years, my last 2 years of medical school, assisting with home birth, it made it really normalized for me, because up to this point, I had only ever seen births in hospitals. Because for us on the navigation, or for specifically for my family, most of my aunts and uncles were born in hospitals. Even though like for Indian Health Services on the navigation, our first facilities in terms of hospitals were built in the 1950s, like 50s to 70s. And so prior to 50s and 70s, all of my aunts and uncles were born at home. And then up from that point on, from the 70s on, all my aunts and uncles were born in hospitals, because there's just a really big push toward having babies in hospitals. And then now we have a lot of internalized fear around, oh, that's where you're supposed to have babies, and that there's a lot of danger around having babies at home now. And so that's kind of the mindset that I had before I started my midwifery training. And then once I started my midwifery training, then it became more normalized for me that, oh, you can have a birth at home, and all the pieces being taken care of, all these different ways to have babies, because I saw people have babies in the water. I saw people having babies standing up. I saw them having babies like laying down and sideways, like all these different ways, and the different ways that people present, because there's some people that have babies and they're quiet and they just go inward. And then there's other people that it's normal for them to have like really outward expression. And then I also did training with Zigitwan. So the Navajo Nation and Changing Women Initiative hosted a training for we're now the Diné Doula Collective. And so when I did that training, that was just a really great experience for me, like connecting with other people that were Indigenous in the birth world and seeing like all the different work that people are doing. And this picture is actually from that training. And so this created a nice network around different people that were interested in learning doula work. But it's also interesting because when we started going through the training and talking about it, it's like, oh, a lot of people are already doulas. They just don't have the title around what they're doing in the community. And so that was really, really nice to learn and see the different ways that we could support one another. And so this is when I was pregnant. So at the end of my naturopathic medical training, we wanted to have a baby. And so this was a planned pregnancy. So up until this point, I had been really doing my own work around healing around my sexual assault from when I was a child. And so this looked like going to counseling for those couple of years before, and then going to EMDR. And that was one of the things that really helped me. And then we started talking about like getting ready to be pregnant. And one of the things that we had to address was that my partner works in EMS. And so he is a firefighter and EMT. And one of our really big taboos for as Diné people is that we are not supposed to be around death. And so when you're pregnant, you're not supposed to be around dead bodies. You're not even supposed to look at roadkill. Like those are all very taboo things. And so my partner, it's his job to go into a burning building. And if there's bodies in there, they're the ones that actually have to clean it up. And so that is like him being directly exposed to that and then bringing it home. And so the way that we addressed that was that we talked, so my dad is actually a medicine person. And so we talked with him about it and we talked with other relatives. And so what we had him do was we have a specific ceremony, it's called a blackening ceremony. And in that ceremony it's called a lightning tea. And so he would take that with him to work and then he would make that into a tea and then drink that and then put it on himself in his car and all the things that he had taken with him to work. And then he would do that before he got home. So then that would get rid of all those things that got attached to him. Because for him personally, we actually had to have that ceremony done for him too, because up until that point, he had it had been normalized for him that he was experiencing like having, he called it like shadow people, but like when you're in your dreams and like there's things that are in there in your dreams that like hold you down and then you can't breathe or you can't like move around. And so for us, that's those beings that you get exposed to around death that get attached to you. And then that really start bothering you. And so he had lived his life up until that point, like where that was normal. And so he had the ceremony done. And then once he had that ceremony done, the blackening ceremony, they actually don't bother him anymore. And he's like, oh, like I haven't had this not happen to me in years. It just was part of his life. And so that was one of the things that we addressed before getting pregnant was he had that ceremony done. And then we made sure that he had the lightning tea. So then he would take that with him to work. And then we also did like an offering, and this is not something that's traditionally done, but we just did this because it felt good for me, like to be able to go and do an offering and just pray about like the child that we wanted to bring into the world. And so we went to like the ocean, we went to the river, and we did prayers to like about this child that we wanted to bring into the world. All of this preparation was really like to ease my own fears, because I had fears around like not being able to conceive. Because for the majority of my life, I never wanted to have children. Like I had a really big fear around having children of my own and them experiencing sexual assault. And so that's where a lot of that work around counseling really tried to focus on. And then also like these prayers, I felt like maybe I had internalized some of those fears and was like, what if I can't get pregnant? And so that's where like doing the work around like the spiritual aspects came into play. And then also like seeing a naturopathic doctor who really helped me to focus on like supporting my liver and supporting like making sure that I had like sufficient vitamins in my body and that I could do this, because I had also been coming out of naturopathic school, which is very stressful and can really take a lot of toll in your body. And so that was getting pregnant. And so we got pregnant in March, and then we got pregnant, I want to say, so this is right when the pandemic started. So we got pregnant maybe about 2-3 weeks after everything had shut down. And so contacting birth people, like birth support people, was really interesting because everything had been shut down by then. One of my big things around giving birth was that in my brain, just in terms of my own internalized fears and also knowing the data around births for Indigenous people, was that I would only give birth either if I could find a midwife here in Portland that could help me give birth at home that was a person of color, or somebody that was back home. And I was just more comfortable going back home on the reservation because that's where I was born. The more like we have the majority of our nurses and our care providers are now Native or people of color at our Indian Health Services hospital. And so that's where I was comfortable. And so those were kind of like my two choices in my brain of like, I got to find midwife here, or I'm flying home to have my baby. And so I was able to find a midwife here. Her name is Rosemary La Perena, and she is Puerto Rican, and she was amazing. So we initially met on Zoom. And we had our first couple of meetings that way, just kind of getting to know one another. And then as we kind of moved through the pandemic, and then also as I was getting bigger, then we would do a Zoom meeting, and then we would do in person, and we would go back and forth. And then my partner also was not allowed to come at the very beginning because we didn't know the pandemic was going to be like exactly. We didn't know how things were spread. And so my partner actually wasn't able to come initially to my prenatal appointments until I think I was maybe in my second trimester. There was also risk around him because he does work as an EMS provider, so they're in direct contact with people that have COVID. And so that was one of the things we also had to navigate, is like whether he should be allowed to go to our prenatal appointments. And so it was a great experience working with a midwife. And we also had to navigate like our traditional ways, because we have a ceremony, Diné ceremony, in our third trimester, and that ceremony is for the baby, and so it's for the baby's transition into this world. And so we ended up driving back home. So from Portland back home is about a 20-hour drive. And so we had to drive back home for that ceremony, and then we drove all the way back. And that ceremony was attended by, I think it was just like my parents and maybe one of my uncles. And so for us, that was really important, because one of the things that our taboo is you're not supposed to tie things. And so in pregnancy, you're not supposed to tie things, because that is directly connected to the umbilical cord, and how, and so if you're tying things, you can get knots in the umbilical cord, or you can get the umbilical cord wrapped around the neck. And so you as a birthing person and your birth partner are not allowed to tie things. And so for my partner's job, like he works as a firefighter. And so they're constantly like, they do search and rescue. And so they tie knots all the time. And so one of the things that they did was that they taught my partner how to do, in our ceremony, the Hajondra ceremony in third trimester, there's a part of the ceremony where they tie knots in a certain way, where once they tie the knot, they put it on your belly button, and then they pull it, and the whole thing comes undone. And so they taught him how to do that. So then we did that every night when he was home. And so that undoes those knots that happen during that we're tying while I'm pregnant. And so that's one of the things that they do in the Hajondra ceremony, is that they undo those knots. And what they're really praying for is for that smooth transition of that baby into this world. And then they're also praying for that child from when they're born all the way into old age. And so it's not praying about like material things, but it's praying about like their ability to think, their ability to speak, their like all these different things that go into who they are and their being. And those are the things that they're praying about in those songs. And so that ceremony goes from like midnight until like 5 a.m. And so there's a lot of support around the birthing person and the baby coming into this world. And so in pregnancy, like we can't buy things for our babies, because in Diné ways that we see that when babies are inside of our womb, they're not ours. They're still connected. For us, we see it as they're connected to beams of light into the third world, into our bodies, into this world here. And it's still that way all the way until they're born and they have their first laugh. And so they have not chose you, and they have not chose to stay here. And so when you start buying things ahead of time, that you're kind of like you're jumping over the barriers of like things that are supposed to happen. And so one of the things that we talk about is like the deities are watching you. Like we have all these different deities in the world, and our deities are like the sky, the earth, the wind, all these different things. These are our deities, and so they're constantly watching us and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves and we're taking care of our child. And so yeah, it's important the way that you carry yourself in pregnancy and the way that you're taking care of the baby, because we have taboos around like not killing things. So like for us, we do like traditionally we are people hunt and we like butcher sheep, and so there's certain parts of those cultural activities that we can do and we can't do. So like you can't be the person to cut the sheep's neck, but you can be the person to help skin the sheep when you're in the community. um, and so yeah, we just had to navigate some of those things. um, and then my daughter was born. So my daughter was born on December 11th. And so the couple of weeks leading up to her birth, she was transverse, not so usually transverse. So if we think of baby's head, so this baby's head and this baby's body, transverse is usually this. She wasn't sideways in my belly. She was just kind of face to the side like that. So imagine this being her face. So she is supposed to be this direction and she was constantly faced this way. And so toward the end of my birth, our midwife was giving us different exercises to really try to get her to turn. And one of the things that they had me do was there's a spinning babies where you can do different exercises, and they had me like with my legs on the couch and then bending forward like upside down kind of. And so they had me do that every night, and I would do it for maybe like 30 seconds. And then on Thursday night, I was like, oh, I'm going to stay down here for a little bit longer. So I was like staying there, down on the floor. And then I was like, oh, I felt something. And it just felt different. Like usually I could feel her kick and it kind of felt like a kick, but it felt different. And then I was like, I think I have to get up. And so then my partner helped me get up. And as soon as I got straight upward, like it just came like water just came out, and I was like waddling to the bathroom. And then my midwife had given me a little indicator Q-tip, because by that time I was 39 weeks, I believe. I was 39 weeks, and she was due the next Friday. And so I went to the bathroom and I did the little indicator strip, and what happens is it turns yellow if it says it's amniotic fluid. And so I swiped it and it turned yellow, and I was like, oh, it's my water. And so then oh, actually, I'm gonna backtrack, because of that morning at 3 a.m, I was asleep, and then I had like a really sharp pain, and I swear I heard somebody like knock at the window like really hard, like it sounded like thunder. And I was like, and I woke up and I jumped up. I was like, oh, that was very painful. It's like, why is somebody knocking at the window? And then I went to the bathroom, and then I had wiped, and there was a little bit of like the red mucus that came out, and I was like, oh, it was just like, it was her. It was Duturba. And then I went back to sleep, and then I went to work the next day, and then this was that evening. So then that was my last day at work, and then we had done the spinning babies. I was upside down, and then I got right side up, and now the water is coming out. So the water came out. I went to the bathroom, and then I let my midwife know. It's like the indicator strip turned colors, and she's like, okay, like just try to get as much rest as you can, because this was about like maybe 10 o'clock at night. And she told me to try to get as much rest as I can, try to lay in bed, try to get some sleep, eat some snacks. And then she told me it was like when you start getting contractions, because at that time I didn't really have any contractions. And so she told me when you start getting them more regularly, you can use the app to try to start timing them. And so then I was like, okay. And then I tried to lay down, and then that's when like the contractions started, and I was like, okay, now, and it wasn't really painful, but it was also painful enough that I couldn't sleep. And so then I was like, well, I don't want to sleep. And so then I was on the birth ball and on the edge of the bed, and just trying to sleep, like sitting up, because that was the only way that it was comfortable, because laying down was really painful. And so then the contractions started getting more regular around between 1 and 3 in the morning. And so between 1 and 3, it started getting more regular and more painful. And then around 3 o'clock in the morning is when I called my midwife, and I was like, okay, they're more regular, they're happening really often. And so then it was within the timing that she was like, okay, I will be over. And so she came over. And then from that point on, the only reason that I have this next part of the story is because my partner is an EMT and wrote down all the times. And he charted it as if I was a patient. Because I have no sense of time of what was happening during this. I was like, I had my daughter in the evening. I thought it was still 4 a.m. And so the midwife came over at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she just was still trying to get me to go to bed, trying to lay in bed because she knew just wasn't far enough along yet. And so she was trying to get me to lay in bed, but it was also really painful to be in bed. And what we figured out is that, or for my body, is that I'm short, so I'm only about 5'1", and so my torso is really short. And so when I was pregnant, like I immediately went outward. Like people thought I had twins because like how big my belly was already by like 13 weeks. And it's just because I have a short torso and there was nowhere for her to go inward. So she just came right out really fast. And so when I was really pregnant toward the end, my belly was outward. And so when contractions would happen, when I was laying down, it was enough pressure for her to get pushed on my cervix, which is what you want with a contraction, because that's helping to dilate to get your cervix to open. And so that's what was happening when I was laying down, is that she was further into my torso and pushing downward on my cervix. And that's why it was more painful, versus when I was sitting up, then she was like forward out on my belly. And so what the midwife did was get a rebozo, and then she put it around my belly, and then I had control. So I actually had it over my shoulders like this. And so then I would pull it down every time that I had a contraction. That way I was able to lift her up on myself. And then I felt like I had more control of what was happening, because when I was on my side, I felt like I just had no control over the pain. And so that really helped me give me more confidence, and also make me feel like I had control over what was happening in my body at that time. And so we did that for a while, and I ate some snacks. And then eventually I ended up going to the bathroom. And so when I was in the bathroom, I was on the toilet, and that felt really comfortable. And so I ended up like planting myself on the toilet. I'm gonna check the chat really quick. Oh, yeah. And so I was on the toilet, and that just felt more comfortable. And so I planted myself in there for a good couple hours. And this is where I was like, I thought I was in there for 30 minutes, but apparently I was in there for more than a couple hours. And so when I was in there, I really didn't want support. What I really wanted was my partner to just hold my hand. And so I held his hand, and then every time I had a contraction, I'd like squeeze it, and then that was it. And it was like, don't touch me. And then eventually my partner sat on a stool in the bathroom, and then I sat right in front of him. So my arms were over his armpits, and I was squatting. And we stayed there for about 3 hours. In my brain, that felt like 30 minutes. And so we were there in the bathroom with me squatting, and that's where my daughter was born. And I did have to have a little bit of direction in terms of like downward pushing. So my midwife had to like push downward and be like, okay, push here. And that's where I pushed. And then she was born. Immediately after she was born, my partner took my shirt off, because we talked a lot about like how the skin to skin was really important. And so that was his job, was to make sure my shirt got taken off and to put Deterra on my chest. And then she stayed connected to the placenta. They kept her connected to it, and then we had her latch, and then she latched until my placenta was born. And then Deterra and Jordan and the placenta all went to the bedroom, and then I stayed in the bathroom because I had a little bit of bleeding. So I bled quite a lot. I didn't have like an official hemorrhage, but I did bleed enough to get lightheaded. So immediately after, like they were trying to like say my name, and I was not responding at all. In my brain, I was like, oh, I'm perfectly fine. But they were trying to say my name, and I guess I was like swaying a little bit, and they had to like have me sit down and just recover a little bit there before I went to the bedroom. And then we went to the bedroom, and then I got to hold Deterra, and then they waited until all the blood completely went back to her body from the placenta. So the placenta was like the cord was completely white. and then they clamped it, and they cut the cord. And then we kept the placenta, so we were able to take care of that. And for us, traditionally, there is a couple different ways that people take care of the placenta. And for my family, the way that we do it is you keep the placenta and then you wash it off. So when you wash off a placenta and it's completely clean, it's actually white. And so we get about a yard of fabric, and then we put the placenta inside of the yard of that white fabric, and then you tie it up. And we put it inside of a tree on the north side, and then you give an offering with white cornmeal. And so with that cornmeal, you are praying for your child in the same way that you did when you had that hojondra in the third trimester. So you're praying about all them through their entire life into old age. And you're giving that offering because for us, it's an exchange that we have with the earth. So we live on the earth and we give the earth our feces and we give the earth our placentas. And so you give the offering to the earth, and then the earth takes the placenta back. The other way that people take care of the placenta is that some people will bury it. And then they'll bury it similar to the way that we also bury our umbilical cords. So when the baby is born and they have that little stump that's left over, when that falls off, we call it's it. And so that umbilical stump gets buried where you want your child to be pulled to for home, to be called like home. And so it's also usually buried where you want your child to be like. And so for me, my umbilical cord is buried at my grandma's house in the sheep, I think it's in the sheep corral, but people will bury them like in their cornfields, they'll bury them in their sheep corrals, they'll bury them all these different places. Like my daughter's is actually buried by my mom's house on the north side of her house. And so that's where my daughter will be pulled to home too, because she's connected to that through her umbilical cord. And so that was how my daughter was born. And we had a little bit of trouble in the beginning with establishing breastfeeding. And it was because she initially, so one of the things like midwifery wise, most babies are allowed to drop about 10% of the weight within the first 24 hours of when they're born. My daughter dropped about 12%. And it was because I had a lot of trouble latching. And then because of that, I also started getting really engorged. And so I had so much engorgement that she wasn't able to latch anymore. And so fortunately, we were able to connect with our midwife who connected with us to a lactation consultant. And so they were able to come to our house and they weighed her. And what they ended up finding was she didn't have a tongue tie, but she did have tightness in her mouth. And she was a little bent. And my partner is like, oh, it's because like I have a little torso, and like she's a really tall baby, and she's still really tall. Like she has his height and not my height. And so she was really bent to one side when she was born. And so she really liked one boob because it was easier for her to bend her head that way. And she didn't like the other side because she was not bent that direction. And so we had to do a lot of body work with her. And so they gave us different exercises to do to help stretch her muscles out and to relax her body to be able to straighten back out and to relax her jaw to be able to like do the latching and correctly. Because when you latch for a baby, like you really want to get really wide mouth and you want them to like stick the nipple to the top of their mouth and to suck upward. And so if babies aren't able to do that entire mechanism, they have a lot of trouble establishing breastfeeding, which is what she had, because she had the imbalance in her muscles. And so she didn't need a revision. And so what a revision is when you have to actually cut the tissue, because sometimes babies, like the tissue that connects the bottom of your tongue or the top of your lips, if it doesn't stretch far enough, then babies can't reach to be able to pull the nipple into the mouth correctly. And so she didn't need that. She just needed body work. And so that's what we had to do. Was we saw like a chiropractor who did some body work. And then we also had the lactation consultant, and then they gave us all the exercises to be able to do with her to help her out. And then she did great after that. And then she was able to meet and like exceed a lot of the weight and height milestones for her age. And so her cradle board, so this picture is Dituraba and her cradle board, and it's my mom and my dad. My mom's tying her. This is the very first time that she is put inside of her Wits Oz. And so her cradle board, traditionally our cradle boards are made by a male relative, and it's usually the partner or the birthing person's brothers or uncles. And so this was actually made by my little brother. And my paternal grandparents, they are the ones that made cradle boards, and then they passed this on. And so this is the very first one that my little brother made. And so he went out to where we're from, and he harvested this cedar. And so what they do is they cut down the cedar, and it's made, actually the entire thing is made from one tree. And so they split it down the middle, and then they put it inside the earth, and then you're able to mold it to be able to get the rain. So the piece that goes across is a rainbow. And so all the different pieces to the cradle board, they have stories around it and how they protect the baby. And so they are correlated to different deities. So the one for the rainbow, and then like the ties are like female and the male lightning. And so they all have different meanings to them. And so her cradle board was made by my little brother. And then because we were mid-pandemic, my parents, so my mom originally was supposed to come when my daughter was born, but then we had to push that out a little because she's a nurse, and they weren't allowing travel at that time. And so my mom and my dad came a little bit later when she was about 2 months old. And I really appreciate the cradle board, because up until this point, me sleeping with her was holding her on a pillow and sleeping upright, because that was the only way I could sleep. And because she would not let me put her down. And so I would put a little like airplane pillow around my neck and just like hold her. And that was the only way I could sleep, because anytime I moved her from that pillow from my arms, she would cry, and then I wouldn't be able to sleep. And so I was getting very, very little sleep. As soon as my parents brought the cradle board and we put her in there, it was amazing because I could feed her in the cradle board, and she could not tell whether or not I moved her. And I got so much more sleep, and she just was a lot calmer, because it gives you gives them the feeling of being held. And for us, like we talk about, like when babies cry a lot, it's them asking to be put in a cradle board is what we say. And so it helped us a lot in terms of like my mental health and my ability to sleep once we were finally able to get it. And then this is her first laugh. So for Diné people, our first laughs, we have a ceremony when babies have their first laugh. And traditionally, it's actually when babies start making sound with their own vocal cords, which can happen within the first couple of days or weeks. Nowadays, people usually say it's an actual laugh. So they wait until like somebody actually makes the baby laugh and they have a little bit of a chuckle, like it's really cute. And so with the person that makes the baby laugh, actually has to host a dinner. And so they cook food for the entire community, and then everybody comes over and they're celebrating this baby, because this is actually the celebration of that child finally being part of the community. Because we don't celebrate in the way of doing baby showers. The way we celebrate babies is we celebrate this first laugh, because this is the baby telling us that they have chosen to stay with us, and that the deities have let go of those beams of light that are holding them into the other world, and they are going to stay here, and now they're going to be a part of the community. And so the big thing with this is this creates kinship and community for that child. And so all the people that come over, there's a little inside of the basket that I'm holding, there's a little bag of salt crystals. And so those salt crystals, we put that salt crystal in Dituraba's hand, and then it goes on every plate of food that of all the people that come to the dinner. And then in addition to that, you are supposed to make gifts. And so you make gifts and you give that to every person that comes out. And so this is establishing that kinship and that relationship with those people in the community and your child. And so this is a really important ceremony. And this is usually like the ceremony that we have. And it's not like, people are not supposed to give gifts to you. This is you giving the gifts out to the community. And so this is Jaturaba's first steps. She is now 17 months old, and she's real cute. She's walking around. So for us, we don't have babies wear shoes until they can start walking. So once they start walking, this is when they can officially wear moccasins and start wearing shoes. It's also when they can start getting their hair cut. So up until this point, we don't cut their hair at all. And so this is just another really big milestone and celebration that we have in our community, is around the first steps that babies have. And so currently I practice naturopathic medicine. I finished graduating and had my baby in 2020. And I got licensed and I practice here in Portland, Oregon. So a lot of my practice is around supporting birthing people that are trying to get pregnant. And my really big thing is really trying to educate people that are currently pregnant and postpartum, and really trying to prevent a lot of things that happen, which is where, like, if there's a really big gap in care between when people have babies and people like follow up for things that happen to them in postpartum. So like if you experience that, like everybody in pregnancy experiences that separation in abdominal muscle, but if you don't work on like doing belly binding, and for us traditionally in that postpartum period, like we use our sash belts, and our sash belts, you're supposed to wear that sash belt. So like in the picture that we have on for today's Zoomcast, like the sash belt that I have on, like that's the one you're supposed to wear in postpartum, and you're supposed to wear that every day, like immediately after you have your baby, because that's going to help push the organs back together. That's going to help the muscles to get closer together to re-knit themselves. And then like in using our traditional medicines, you can also use like the juniper boughs, which is what we traditionally did, is putting the juniper boughs inside of the sash belt and being able to hold that together. And so a lot of my practice is around that, in terms of being able to support using our traditional medicine, using naturopathic medicine, and then also understanding like how to physically support somebody in the postpartum period. And then the childbirth education pieces, I teach online virtual childbirth education classes, covering a lot of like that pregnancy portion, which is like the first trimester, covering like what things happen in the body. And my really big thing with this is just that I didn't have this. Like I tried to search for different supports around like being pregnant and having childbirth education classes, and it just didn't feel culturally relevant, a lot of the classes that I took. And so I wanted to be able to offer that for people in how to incorporate our culture into it, because it's really important. It's really important for our like children's lives, and for us to be able to get through pregnancy and be like really happy about it. And yeah, and then I also do some doula services, and a lot of that was virtual, but I'm wanting to do that more in person now. And here is my contact information, my email address, and my website if you want to learn more information. And Rhonda, I am done now.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and change the settings so that it can be conversational and you can unmute yourself. So I see in the message, and yeah, did you want to talk more about just the traditional use of the sash belts and squatting and pelvic floor release, and if you wanted to just chat a little bit about that?
Sure, I could do that. So traditionally we use our sash belt in pregnancy, actually to help really support so in pregnancy, what happens is that there's ligaments that hold the uterus, and the uterus is kind of like a free floating organ that's kind of out there. And then there's ligaments that are holding it to our body. And so in pregnancy, it's able to shift and move around and do that because it's not really attached to something. So this can kind of negatively affect our body, in that when we're pregnant and it's moving around, it's really stretching those ligaments, and those ligaments attach like into the labia, into the vaginal area, and then they're also attaching into the hips. And so when we start experiencing all those different pains in those different areas, like doing those stretchings can help, but it's also like really helpful to do different types of support around the hips, especially when we get into later pregnancy, when we're getting a lot of those hormones that are like really relaxing the pelvis, because then it starts to feel like, oh, my health, like my hips are falling apart. Like once you get to that point in like third trimester where it just feels really uncomfortable and loose, that's when you really want to do a lot of support with like using the sash belt, because like commercially they make products where it's like a belly band where there's a bunch of like Velcro pieces that go across. But if you have a sash belt and you have somebody that can help you wrap it around you, it can be really helpful. So you want to do wrapping around your hips and then into under the belly. And so if you saw that picture, it's actually funny because the picture that I have posted for the Zoomcast today, that's a picture that was taken for my graduation. And so my sisters immediately messaged me and were like, "Are you pregnant?" Because they knew immediately that that's how you wear it when you're pregnant. Because otherwise you're supposed to wear it up around your waist. And so that's where you want to kind of wear it, is how it's pictured in the picture, is like around the hips and then supporting under the belly, because you're really helping to support those ligaments that are holding the baby up. And then when you get into postpartum, immediately after having the baby, what we do is you go out and you go to a juniper bush, and it's usually a really young juniper bush, and you want to collect from the bottom row. And so you want to take your corn pollen out there, you use your corn pollen and you let the tree know what it's going to be used for, that you're going to be using it to help heal yourself, that you're like all these different pieces, you pray to it. And then you clip off some of the juniper branches, and you want to have just enough to last you a couple days, because you want to recollect it every couple days, because you want it fresh, you want it to where it still has some of that sap on it. And so you take it home with you, and then you clip off some of the green bits, so you want one that is nice and fresh and still really young. And then you make it into a tea. And so you make it into a really strong tea, and you can brew it, and you just put it inside of water and you put it on the stove. And then you brew the tea, and then you want to drink at least 1 or 2 cups of that a day. And the rest of it you can keep in the fridge and just keep, you make more of it afterwards. And then the juniper branches, usually traditionally, because we have wood stoves in our homes, you would put that juniper branch on the stove and warm it up. And then you would put a piece of cloth on your belly, and then put the juniper branch on there, and then put another piece of cloth over that, and then wrap the sash belt around your belly. So it's the juniper and the warmth on your belly that are staying on there for the entire day. Because I don't have a stove in my house, what I did was I just got a cloth, and I warmed up some hot water, and I put the cloth in there, and then I wrung it off, and then I had a wool cloth on my belly, and then I put the warm cloth, and then I put the juniper cloth in the middle, and then another cloth over that, and then I wrapped my sash belt around my belly. And so I did that. I would wear my sash belt. So you're supposed to wear it like pretty much all the time, immediately after baby is born, like almost 100% of the time. And then every week you decrease that by about like 20 to 10 to like 20%. So then you're wearing it for at least 6 weeks. And then that very last week, you're only wearing it for maybe about 10% of the time. And so this is going to really help to support the core, and it's helping to like bring the hips together. It's helping to heal your belly. And then we're also helping to prevent like that diastasis, because it's really pushing those muscles back together and to restitch. Because what happens when people get a diastasis and the belly muscle separate is that you get a lot of low back pain. So people that get low back pain postpartum, and then especially like sitting down and like leaning over and bending, where like your core is the one that's supposed to be supporting you, but now that it's not together, you get a lot of that low back pain. And so for people that do experience that, and maybe like they're a couple years out and they still have a diastasis, where like, and the way you can assess this on yourself is like, if you put your hand like this, and then you put it in the middle between your belly button and the top of your ribs, and you did a little bit of a crunch and there's space. So there's some people where like there's this much of a space, and normally you only want 1 finger of a space between the 2 muscles that come together. And so if you have that on your body, I would highly suggest to go see somebody, because if it's going to affect your health in terms of your back. If you experience like discomfort in your low back and into the pelvis, that can really affect it.
Hey, any other questions or comments? And I'm also happy to turn off the recording if anyone would like me to do that as well.
Hello.
Hey.
Thank you so much for sharing. My name is Eugenia. I'm calling from Cheyenne, Arapaho Territory, and my good friend Jenna. We're both birth workers. I'm pregnant with my number two. Um, my ancestors are from New Mexico and Texas, of both indigenous and colonizer descent. And I've been practicing a lot of different modalities since I was very young, but my birth was really began at 12 in the hospital, and until recently, I've been doing practicing curanderismo and Chinese medicine. And I do a lot of birth work from a Mexican traditional medicine lens. And I'm wondering, you were talking about the first laugh and the gathering of community, and how that fits in, because in Mexican traditional medicine, we practice the cuarentena, which is like the 40-day resting period, and it's very, very important to not expose the open baby and the open birther to other people's stuff, right? And that's why there's such a close container. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to like the 40-day resting period or whatever resting period y'all hold space for, and then other people's energies in the birthers and the babies.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
And other, I'm asking what kind of resting period postpartum you hold space for and what that looks like, and then how that interacts with other people's energies in the birthers and the baby's space.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely like the same idea around like you're not supposed to bring babies into the public space. It's definitely like frowned upon of bringing babies into the public. They're supposed to be like, you're supposed to keep them at home, and they're not supposed to be around other people. In terms of like holding space and like staying home, I think we have a lot more cultural recognition around like the baby being like staying home. In terms of like the resting period with moms, I feel like for us there's a piece of there's definitely that recognition that it's needed, but this is where like there's a little, at least in terms of like my family, there's a little bit of like, I'm not sure if this is colonization, I don't know if this is cultural, but there's that piece of like of getting back to work, and like it being like for us, like my grandma's big thing was like, oh, being pregnant and giving birth to babies is not a medical condition. It's not a reason to be lazy. Like you still have to like get up, you have to go do the chores, you have to do the things. Like she had a baby and she was like riding horses again because their livelihood was around like taking care of the horses, taking care of the sheep, like doing all the things that had to get done. And so like from my family's point of view, like I feel like there's a lot of that piece. But in terms of like my exposure to other cultures and like understanding that, and like really, I think that is important. Like I think it's really important to have that resting period and really supporting people and like incorporating that into it, because I'm sure that was traditionally like part of what we did, because like there's in terms of like geography where we're located in the Navajo Nation, the Hopi people are right in the middle of where we are. And so in terms of like their cultural practice, like they do a cultural practice of like staying indoors for I think it's like 21 days. And for them, it's the connection of how long it takes when you put a corn kernel in the earth and then for it to sprout. And so it takes 21 days for that corn kernel to sprout and come out into the earth. And so it's that same time period that they have to stay indoors with their babies, and then they can be exposed to the rest of the world, because it's like that time period of when that baby is born, and then they can be exposed to like the sunlight and to the rest of the world. And our culture is very much based around corn. So I don't know if traditionally maybe we have a story that's like that, and maybe we just don't practice that same thing anymore. I'm not sure. Yeah, definitely something I want to ask for like our people that have that knowledge about.
Yeah, and I've had this conversation with, like, for example, some Native Alaskan friends, and they were like, this idea that we didn't go and check our trap lines and, tend to these physical tasks. And I just put forward that when I see people overwhelmed in the postpartum or over just fatigued or causing harm to their bodies and their spirits, that it's often not connected at all to actually, moving their bodies. It's not actually connected at all to that, subsistence connection to, the just natural rhythms that were part of their day. It's much more the demands of modern living and isolation and, getting in cars and sitting in recliners and going to the grocery store and just pieces like that, I feel like, we need to, make that translation of that. Yes, I'm still going to encourage everyone to physically rest and heal their bodies. And also this idea that movement isn't also healing in the postpartum. It can feel really contradictory. And so I've shifted the conversation of, instead of, that we should be in bed, it's that, we should be doing things that feel nurturing to us and pushing all of the other things away. If it feels good to stretch your body and go for a light walk, that's not the same thing as hitting a gym and, being physically exhausted because you're entertaining people and all of their energies in your vulnerable, time when you're needing to heal your body. And so, I just have, I feel like with a lot of things, cutting out all that is extra that doesn't feel good and nurturing to our bodies is what it's about. Whether it's in a bed or, movement that's going to feel different depending on, where people feel and how they need to heal.
I think also too, it comes back to like our first like chosen responsibility of reciprocity. Because like if you're taking that time to yourself, I mean, not time to yourself, but like you're resting, you're in this like growth period. And then when baby has their first laugh, and you mentioned traditionally we're giving gifts, we're not like receiving them, and you're introducing baby into this community, and that's also this exchange of this reciprocal responsibility of what it means to be a community. And so when we're allowed to have that time to like heal, recover, but also like show gratitude in the way that we participate in community. And I've always like appreciated that aspect.
That's my sister.
Oh yeah, yeah, Shada Lakota. Yeah, it's also really cool to hear all of our really heartfelt traditional values of like how yeah, Lakota's my actual sister. And it's really cool to like, so my experience in watching this Zoomcast is I've never seen or heard from like a Western medical perspective of just like the appreciation of what it means to be a doula, and for our traditional values to be like substantiated or validated. And so to like see Lakota presenting on something like this and bringing up these value systems of and the traditional knowledge of what it means to like bring a child into the world, it just feels, my heart is so happy, and like it just feels so empowering. And I'm not I'm not technically a mother, but between my two sisters and Lakota, I have 13 nieces and nephews. And in our tradition, we don't have a term for nieces and nephews. Like all of their kids are basically my kids. And so to see all of that like really kind of come together and to appreciate it in this way, and yeah, to look forward to these experiences, I think, yeah, it's just so like my heart is just like ah. And yeah, so with that, I am just really proud of you, Coda.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I want to thank you as well. And I, we began these Zoom casts like, right as the pandemic was beginning. And it was as I was, witnessing so much loss in my own tribal community and, just separation and fear descending. And I just sat with, what we need to preserve this knowledge, and also so many people who don't have access to their community's healers. Maybe it was because of not being able to travel, and maybe it was because of all of the impacts of colonization, of forced relocation, of adoption, of all these other pieces, and wanted to create a space for sometimes for people to just tell their birth story as an Indigenous family. Also to hear from Indigenous, midwives and birth keepers, and, of all ages and all stages of their journeys. But Lakota, you chose in the title for today's Zoomcast about being, an urban Diné, and I feel like you really spoke very well about how, you sometimes you brought your traditions from home, to your urban home, and sometimes you returned, to your family, or called upon your family or the traditions that you grew up with. And I want to ask you that if you were working with a family and they were, had grown up on that Portland cement, and but they were aching, to heal all of those, that broken lineage and connection that they had, and really wanting to for this next generation coming forward, to restore some of these things. And some of the things that I ask people is, what are the first words that you want your baby to hear? In what language? How do you want to introduce them to the directions? What are the plants that we can bring into the space? Even if it's, in in water, or if we can't smudge, or whatever that is. And so I would love if you could just spend a bit of time. I mean, you're working with families that are, urban Native families, and for people who are just seeing this title and might be drawn to watching this particular Zoomcast, what would you put forward to a family who is, not birthing on their traditional lands, and how they can, reconnect to that deeper way of being?
Yeah. I think, like, in terms of, and I talk about this a lot in like the birth classes that I teach, is like looking at all the different things that we talked about. Like, even if we like taking into colonization into perspective, and like how this has really affected all of our different communities, and how like some people know some of this information and some people don't, but we can still piece together what we want to give to our children and what we want to be able to pass on. And I think that the same thing can be done with births. So an example is that I've shared before in my classes is, for us, we traditionally have a ceremony around puberty. And so a lot of people know our traditional puberty ceremony for the girls, but for the boys, it's really been, it's stopped being done because of wars, because our male puberty ceremony was around creating warriors. And so they stopped doing the ceremony because they didn't want the men to be going off to war anymore. And so in like the 30s and 40s, they stopped doing the ceremony for the boys. And so, but around that is it's also really important for identity, because when you have that ceremony done, it really plants you in where you belong in the world and where you come from. And so we still have those ceremonies for the girls, but the boys, it stopped. And so when my little brother reached puberty, so for us, the way we mark puberty for the boys is when their voices start to crack. And so that voice changing is when is that transition time for them. And so what my dad and my family did was they started asking our medicine people, or just people in general that were older, like what that ceremony used to look like the last time that they saw that done. And just by collecting all this information and talking with people, piece together what that ceremony used to look like, and then use the songs, because our ceremony for the boys was based around the kache, or sweat. And so there's certain songs that are traditionally sung in the sweat. And so they use those songs and then these pieces of the ceremony to create the ceremony. And now they do it again, and it's now being done again, and they're able to pass that on, because that is important, and it creates that identity and sense of space and where you are in the universe. And it really connects you to all these different elements. So I feel like it's the same thing for us in birth. Like, even though everybody maybe in these different places, especially when you're in urban area, feel like there's nothing there, and it's so many things have been lost, we can still go to and talk to, even if there's not people in our community, just going to other communities and seeing like how things are done, because they're all usually really related to like the core of like creating that identity, creating that connection to different elements in the earth, and being able to pass that on to our children. So if you don't have a ceremony around the first laugh, like the reason why that's important for us when we think about anatomy with that first laugh, because when that baby has, like, up until that point, that baby was like created within water, and that little flap that covers for the lungs, like it stays closed. And when they have that first breath of air, that flap opens, and then that their lungs open and inflate. And for us, it's the Diné, which are the wind beings that enter that baby's body, and that fills the lungs up. And so that connects them to the elements of like wind. And so that also like creates the life within them for them to live on this earth. And so there's different aspects of that that we can also recognize in other cultures that you can bring into your culture, which is being able to also pass that on. Because even like in the placenta, like with the placenta, for babies that are, what we talk about is like babies that don't have their placentas buried, like you always see them like always searching for something. And it's those babies and kids that they're always looking for something, and they're digging around in places because they're trying to find like their other piece, that placenta that wasn't taken care of. And so I feel like as like urban people, we can really still like move those things and bring them into the birth space, and incorporate them, and just being able to reach out to communities where we're able to connect with and really bring that into our space and pass that on, because I think it's important to be able to not feel like hopeless. And I feel like sometimes that we can feel like that as like Indigenous people, where because of colonization we've lost so much and it feels like we're disconnected, but we can also still create and pass on those things, because they're like at the core, they're still connected to those elements and these deities that are out there.
I think you said a lot of really important things, Lakota, about like that really kind of expand on what it means to do decolonial work, because like as Indigenous people, we're always going to be Indigenous. And I think like the ways that like our traditional ways are traditional because of who we are as people and how we participated in community. It wasn't ever like blood quantum. It wasn't ever like, you know, there are probably people, not probably, there are people who would come into Diné communities from other parts of wherever. And as long as they could like, or in participating and like having responsibility within the community, like they were accepted, and learning like the language and the tradition and the stories and the traditional knowledge was what made you a Diné person. It wasn't like, it looked differently than how it does today. And I think that a lot of what you're talking about sometimes, like about just like people wandering and searching for something, sometimes is a big part of that. And so when we can adapt and like learn things that are important to us, it really kind of like makes us who we are, regardless of what quantum you are of whatever tribe, you know?
And I think in addition to blood quantum, it's that piece of maybe there are not all the pieces that we can dream of for our babies or our births. Maybe not all of them can be manifested. But what can we gift? You know, what can we do, and what can we provide? You know, like for example, you know, I ached that I there wasn't an Indigenous midwife who could attend my birth, who could be there for me. You know, it had been effectively displaced. And but I was like, but what ceremonies can I invite in? You know, what Indigenous doula may I be able to bring in? You know, what are the pieces that are intact? What songs, you know, can I call on? You know, what medicines can be invited in and present? You know, like for example, if we can't smudge, how could we bring that energy in? You know, maybe it's in a necklace, maybe it's in, you know, a spray into the air, maybe it's in water, maybe it's in an altar. But that I think sometimes people are so distracted by this inability to provide the perfect vision, and that we just can't let that exist or happen. And so I you know, I know a lot of just urban folks who have never been able to set foot on the land that is their bloodline. And there's a grief there. There's such an ache and a grief there. But, you know, we could still just, you know, dream in the ceremonies that are wanting to come back to that family. So I hope that anyone who, you know, noticed the title and was just thinking, whether it's because you want to hear from Lakota, hear from a naturopathic midwife, hear from, you know, someone who's Diné, hear from, you know, someone who was urban, whatever it was that drew someone to listen to this Zoomcast, that, you know, you come away with the pieces that you may want or need. Okay, any other comments or conversations before we finish up for today? Amanda.
Okay, hi, I'm Amanda Singer. I had to turn off my camera because I have connection issues. I'm actually calling in from the heart of the Navajo Nation, near Window Rock, Arizona, and my connection is not so great at times. So, but I just want to say I'm so proud of you, Lakota. You have come a long way. I first met Lakota at the Zigidawin Indigenous Doula training in Window Rock, and got to talk to her off and on during that training, and then just hearing her speak, and then her passion for her work during that training, it just really amazed me. And I'm really glad that she's a part of our Diné Doula collective. I'm a full circle doula, and then I'm also a Indigenous breastfeeding counselor and the executive director for the Navajo Breastfeeding Coalition, which the Diné Doula Collective basically runs under their umbrella. And one of the things that we've really been working towards is gaining more of our cultural knowledge and working towards revitalizing our Diné teachings around pregnancy, birth, and lactation, and of course postpartum. And some of the things that I keep in mind is when I really, you know, when I think about Lakota, like especially that she's way out there in the Pacific Northwest, I always think about her. And then also we have a few doulas in the Phoenix metro area and in Albuquerque. And I consider, like, what would they like to know, what would they like to learn, because they primarily practice in the urban Native or Indigenous communities. And then for us here at home, we've been doing a lot of research, but a lot of prayer and faith has really gone into it as well. And I'm really amazed that some of the it's really beautiful to see that the Navajo traditional home birth practices are slowly coming back, slowly getting revitalized. And to see that, and then to be a part of it, and then it's really beautiful now that these families that are requesting that from us, and then they also have the benefit of a Navajo or a Navajo midwife, and that's Nicole Gonzalez. And we go out, and the families have been so gracious as to invite us to sit with them during the birthing person's Jonja ceremony. And because of that, the medicine person that's there, they're very inquisitive. Like during breaks, they start asking us like what we do, and we explain to them. But you should see the beauty of that. It's like after that, and then they see the trust that the family has gained in not only Nicole's group, but also the doulas that are there. Because sometimes I'm there, I do it by myself, and then sometimes I have a backup doula that helps me. And when the medicine people see that, that's when they become very open about sharing more knowledge. They'll start telling us like just small teachings, like how to greet the baby when baby comes earthside, and even down to like which arm you're supposed to use to hold the baby first. And I think it was the right side is the male and the left side is the female. I gotta look at my notes on that, but there was something specific about how you greet them with their arms. And I never really knew that until some of the medicine people have shared their knowledge. And then now, and Lakota is aware of this, within the next several months, I think starting in June, we have another medicine person who has graciously offered to share with our team. They're going to teach us how to sing our Navajo birthing songs. So we're going to start singing, so we can sing that as baby starts making their journey earthside. But there's a lot of we back up, and as much as we can, we back up what Lakota is doing up in the Pacific Northwest. And I really admire you, Lakota, for everything you're doing. And I just want you to know that you continue to inspire all of us. And Nihihat for making this beautiful presentation, and just know that our prayers are always with you to guide you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo just what Amanda was saying. And, thank you both, Amanda and Lakota, for the work that you do, because I think, and just kind of hearing Lakota's story of just like the experience that we have as Native and Indigenous people, and not being able, well, I wouldn't say like not, but just having a very limited resource of people who look like us doing these amazing things. And I think it's changing now for our little ones, our current ones. But part of the reason that I got into the work that I do, I'm an experiential educator, and I do like land-based healing. And a lot of people in the outdoor industry are white. And when I would look to these things, I'd be like, Lakota and I basically grew up in the same place or places. And our understanding of what it meant to be outside, like, we would like herd sheep, and our summers would be filled with like being outside all day. And so I really kind of had this deep appreciation of what it meant to be outside. But then as I was getting older and I was learning about like different kinds of activities that people would do, they were always like white men. And so in a way, like I felt like, you know, that wasn't something that I could do. But then like developing and cultivating this relationship of like being outside and not doing it as like a sport or recreation, but in a concept of healing, and then understanding a responsibility of what it meant to be on the land and to enjoy and cultivate a relationship, I think really kind of like made my career. And I didn't think that was possible, right? And then so like hearing Lakota's story, hearing Amanda, and just having these really freaking awesome people who are doing really super important work and who are like paving the way to really validate and like bring to light a lot of our traditional teachings means so much. And that's a lot of why I was saying like my heart was just beaming, just because like yeah, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of you guys. And that really like warms my heart, and it like gives me a lot of hope and light and insight for bringing Native people into this world. And I think that's like a conversation that a lot of like non-natives have, of just like, why would you bring a child into this world? But as brown people, as indigenous people, it's like, why would you not? Like we need our brown babies and we need them to feel supported and loved and light and like, yeah, we need them. And that's our medicine, and that's who's gonna save the world.
Yes.
And so yeah, all of those things kind of like come together in this conversation about a birthing story of just like how important we are as Native people. And yeah, I currently have COVID and so I'm quarantined right now. And this, I've been feeling like really also super isolated, and yeah, just this brought so much light to just everything, and it's just so also really random. But I am so happy. I'm so proud of you, Coda. Yeah.
Yes, we need so many more of these beautiful babies like we got to see these photos of. And yeah, and something that struck me that when you were just talking about being in land-based education and, you know, versus people hiking, conquering a mountain for sport, like just the difference in there. And I wanted to just say I really appreciated, Lakota, you sharing about your just husband's journey and how to honor his work and, you know, the traditions and honor them. You know, it made me think so much. You know, I just redid this last winter my wilderness EMT certification, which I love the training and I love everything about it. And it's torture to be with, you know, mostly people in the early 20s who want to do snow patrol and all these other things. And I'm sitting here going through this training and you know, I'm like, wait, we just did this really traumatic where 8 people just died in this scenario, and you're going to send us home to bed at 9 p.m. You know, no wonder our first responders are so traumatized, and no wonder so often our midwives and our birth keepers, you know, don't survive the full extent of the time of their calling because we're not honoring that, you know, the systems aren't honoring or letting us walk and train and be and exist, you know, in these modern ways the craft is being taught and held, and, you know, the traditions that we need to honor. And so I just wanted to thank you, Lakota, for bridging that in, because I just really appreciated, you know, the role that, you know, he didn't just go to work and be like, well, this is what I do. And he didn't separate or, you know, or falsely act as if he was separating, you know, who his self was doing this work. And what he was bringing home to his home. He honored that they were both existing and creating those spiritual protections around it. And so I just wanted to say that I really appreciated that aspect of your sharing as well. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, any other thoughts or comments before we end for today? And I also want to add, Amanda, you know, we often have a small crowd of people who attend these Zoomcasts live, but they are edited and are on the Center for Indigenous Midwifery website, as well as Vimeo, YouTube, and multiple podcast formats. And so that's one of the ways that I use this is if I you know, am working with a Navajo family, I can be like, I'm not the person who can teach you about your traditions, but I'm going to, you know, try and help provide you with any resources that I can, and any other stories of people that are can help be guides for you, even if you know you live in, you know, Seattle, Washington, and you know, far away from people that you would love to be able to ask. So I just wanted to share that's one of the ways that you know, the collection of, I think you're episode 36, I believe. One of the purposes is, you know, being able to be like, oh, you're Maori. Here is you know, words from, you know, a Maori birth keeper directly from them. And so I wanted to just, you know, make sure that that is known and shared, that, you know, thank you all of you who are here today, and, you know, that this is able to be continued on and shared with people while they're driving their car or whatever else they need as we move through life and utilize our virtual resources. Okay. Any last thoughts, or are we finished for now? I'll just point it back towards you, Lakota, to close, and then we'll end for the day.
Well, thank you all for listening to everything we talked about and being part of the conversation. And it's really nice to meet all of you. And I hope to possibly meet you all maybe in the future sometime in person. All right. Well, have a good evening.